This, by the way, is a great book, Team of Teams. It hit all the bestseller lists in the spring. And until I met Stan on the phone last week, I hated him because I had a book that came out in the same period of time called Team Genius. And I think we sold about one book for 20 of yours. But it's an absolutely fantastic book. Go out and get it and spread it among your teams. Let's put some flesh on the bones for Chris's introduction and take us through your military career and some of the key inflection points that, along the way of you becoming a four-star general, and then that real awakening you had that led you to realize that the organization of the military at a fundamental level had to change.
Yeah, thanks, Rich, and thanks, Jamie, and everybody for having me here. It's a real honor, and Chris, thanks for the overly kind comments. I grew up in an Army family. My father was a soldier, and my father's father was a soldier. My four brothers were soldiers. My sister married a soldier. I married the daughter of a career soldier. Her three brothers were soldiers. So you get it. We were on the federal dole for all our lives. I went to West Point at age 17 in the summer of 1972, which was statistically the easiest year in West Point's history to be admitted, because it was right near the end of Vietnam and it wasn't very popular. So most years I would not have gotten in. I did get in. I didn't take the place very seriously. They took themselves very seriously, and that was a problem. And I didn't learn most of what they tried to teach me. They spent 2 years trying to teach me calculus, and I really didn't learn it. But then, as I told them not long ago, not once in the 40 years since then have I been in a moment when, if I could have integrated an equation, I'd have been better. So then I went into my military career, starting as a paratrooper, and spent time in the Special Forces and then in the Rangers and a number of places. An interesting career, but still, the military is a big bureaucracy. It's great, but it's a bureaucracy, and you become a product of that. And for me, it really changed after 9/11. Not because of the attack, but because some fundamental things. I deployed early to Afghanistan. I was a brand new brigadier general. I spent time in Afghanistan. I came home. Then I was back in the United States when the invasion of Iraq occurred. And then in the fall of 2003, about 6 months after we'd been in Iraq, I was put in command of an organization called JSOC, or Joint Special Operations Command. And that is a collection of the most elite counterterrorist forces the United States has. And it was formed after the failure of the Iran rescue mission, April 1980. And what they did was they said, we are not going to try to do an ad hoc response to very difficult things like that situation turned out to be, because the mission, of course, failed. And so they created JSOC, and they put Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Rangers, some aviation units, and they put it in this dream team construct. And it was extraordinary people, absolutely exquisitely trained and lavishly resourced, put together to be this dream team. And for many years, from 1981 to 2003, it was successful time and again in employments in different wars and things between wars that occurred. And I'd spent a lot of time in that organization, but I'd never been the commanding general. And so when I took over in the fall of 2003, that's different. And so I take over, and this organization is very good, very successful, very powerful in its culture, not just the big organization, but in each part of the organization. And we ran into something we'd never run into before. It was completely different, and it was disorienting to us. We had been against traditional terrorist organizations, which at their heart are traditional hierarchies. They're pyramid-shaped hierarchies. You could draw out General Motors, you could draw out the government, you could draw out anything, and it would look a lot like Al-Qaeda originally, or other terrorist groups we'd seen. And they tended to be pretty ponderous because they're a bureaucracy, and they've got to protect their security and whatnot, so they tend to have a very strong autocratic leader who's inspirational and disciplinary, and then they tend to have tight discipline, particularly in how they communicate. And so when I got into Iraq, and we knew that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was forming, it was metastasizing like a cancer, we immediately looked for this pyramidal-shaped bureaucracy and go after it. Because the way you go after one of these is you start to identify the pieces, and then when you've got enough of them, you go after the key nodes or people all at once to try to cause it to implode upon itself because it can't respond quickly.
Well, there's even a saying, you chop off the snake's head and the snake will die.
That's exactly right. And so we tried to do that, but what we found is that's not what we saw. Instead, we were running into this network, this constantly shifting polymorph, I guess you'd call it, and what it did was it learned amazingly quickly. It could strike constantly. Every time you struck it, instead of being weakened significantly, it just adapted organically. And we thought, well, maybe this is this brilliant construct of this leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And what we realized, and we didn't at first realize this, we came to understand what it was, exactly what John Chambers had talked about. We were in an inflection point. And that inflection point was we were now in a different environment. It wasn't that Al-Qaeda was so smart, it was that suddenly they were empowered by information technology like no organization before, terrorist group or otherwise, had ever been empowered. So they had the DNA of something completely different, and it made them unbelievably successful because they were so fast and so different, and we were so imperfectly constructed to take them on.
What was the day like or the week like when you came to that realization? And then following that, what did you conclude that you had to do?
Yeah, we started, when I took over, we're doing raids against what they call HVTs or high value targets and capture or kill these guys, and the idea you'll cripple the organization. And we were doing about one raid a week. And if you think most organization, if you're capturing or killing a key leader once a week, that's pretty much of a drumbeat. But we're not having any real effect on them. So we did what a lot of organizations do. We just put the pedal down harder. We'll do everything we do. We'll just do it better and we'll do it faster. And we got better. So by this, I've been in command about 9 months, and we're now doing 18 raids a month, or one every other night. And we thought that that was the fastest you ever could. And under that construct, it was. Under our hierarchy, operating and empowered by technology, that was warp speed. But we're falling further and further behind. We're losing the war against these guys. And we came to the conclusion that the problem is we came out to play football, and they're playing a completely different sport. And our cleats and our pads and our helmets aren't working well on the basketball court. And so we started a journey to change Joint Special Operations Command in the middle of the fight. We're an organization that's very good, very self-confident, and not very interested in changing. And that became sort of the journey that I was a part of.
And as hard as that's a hard thing to do with any existing organization, but particularly it would seem to me the U.S. military, where hierarchy and chain of command is the very essence of what the Army is all about.
Well, it is, and also excellence is part of what the Army wants. Most soldiers' heart is they want to be given a task and they want to get to where they can do it really well, whether it's drill or shooting or whatever, and they want to perfect that. And then the Army wants to perfect it organizationally. They want to write a manual on how to do it, and they want to have a checklist, everybody do it this way, and that'd be great. And that gives a predictable outcome for a mass organization. And also the people in the organization were very proud of their organization. Delta Force is long-term professionals. They're not young kids. They're mid-30s and 40s. I went on a raid with one of the troops one day, and we're going to go on this helicopter interdiction of these moving cars called a vehicle interdiction. And it's about 15 guys and me, the commanding general, come along, which they're not too excited about. But I come out there and I look, and the age of the guys, I went to the sergeant major, I said, "Oh my God." He said, "Yes, sir, we're not worried about getting shot. We're worried about falling and breaking a hip." And so, I mean, that's kind of the way it is, but that gives them a different demographic, a different mindset. They're not, when you're 18, you're bulletproof. When you're 38 and you got a kid in college and a wife of 20 years, you're not. And so they didn't want to change because that was their identity. That was what made them special. That's what they were used to. That's what they were great at. And yet you ask them to say, let go of everything you're great at and be something different. And of course, across all the organizations, because we had Delta Force of SEALs, you had this. And then between them, you'd think that all these organizations are so much alike that they're going to be close friends. Well, they're so much alike that they hated each other. They wouldn't communicate across the lines. They, Delta hated the SEALs hated Delta. Both of them looked down at the Rangers. It was just this dynamic that you see. Yeah. And nobody wanted to deal with aviators because, who would, right? So you have these silos of really good people that are functional and they're tribal in nature. And so that tribal part is cohesion and it's positive, but it's also really hard to make them more than the sum of the parts.
Where did you, every great leader has to prioritize, and you knew what you wanted. You wanted something that was much more adaptable and horizontal, but how did you break down those old walls? How did you start?
Yeah, well, here's the first thing. I had no idea what I wanted. I took over, and you want to have the theory that the leader comes in and they've got this amazing vision and they've got the wisdom to plot a perfect course, and all everybody's got to do is follow the leader and we'll do a conga line to excellence. And I didn't have a clue. The one thing I did know was we were losing. And you get in a meeting with people and you go, we're really having problems here, we need to change. And a bunch of people say yes, and then somebody in the room goes, let's not rush to failure. And I hate that person. I want to choke them. Because they sound really sage, they sound like the one adult in the room, because they're not going to let the headstrong leader take them in a bad way. And my response to him was, hey, we don't have to rush anywhere. We're failing right here. We can stay right here if we want. And so the one argument I was able to make is the status quo was the one option that was not an option. And then people would say, well, we need a detailed plan before we rush off and do something. And I said, I have no clue. All I know is we got to go generally in that direction. We're going to start moving and you're going to figure it out in the organization. And the reason I did that is, one, I didn't know how to get there. And two, had I tried to give a detailed plan, they would have poked holes in it, and they would have been fair because it wouldn't have been a great plan. Instead, what I said is, we're going to get there, and I know it's not going to be a straight line because we don't know, but we're going to get there, and we as a group, in fact, you are going to figure it out, and I'm going to be, just the ringleader of this circus. And that really worked well in that organization because they owned the change then, and they also they felt as though they could control it, that I wasn't telling them what to do. I was giving them the thing, and they could decide how we got there.
Well, you have a great phrase in your book called eyes on, hands off.
Yeah.
Is that what you communicated to them, and is that how you changed yourself as a leader?
Well, I didn't know that initially, but when I took command, we, just like our opponents who now had a lot of information technology, we suddenly had this amazing amount of technology. So I could sit in the command center. We had about 12 screens, flat panel screens, and we had computers. And I could watch every one of our operations, whether it was in Somalia, Afghanistan, or Iraq. I could watch it in real time from a Predator, full motion video, so on TV. And we pumped through our secure internet all the radio transmissions. So even talking between us, two sergeants on the ground in Afghanistan, I could listen to that conversation in Iraq, and if I wanted to, I could talk to them. Now, I never once did talk to them. But for someone who wants to micromanage, this is finally manna from heaven. I could micromanage everyone. But that's the fatal trap. The fatal trap is thinking that because I can, I should. And part of the problem with leaders is you ought to feel like I should because it's my responsibility. I have all this amazing information. Nobody else has got this information but me, and so I ought to do my job. Fortunately, we came to the conclusion, and I realized pretty rapidly, I didn't know what's happening on the ground. I see it in two dimensions and I hear them, but I don't know really what's happening. They do. So instead of taking the information flows up to the all-knowing command center, we pump the information back down to inform everybody so that now instead of knowing what they were doing there, they also knew the big picture to a level never attainable before. And then we said, you make the call. And we called it shared consciousness. What we did is we turned upside down the information system, pumped it out to people, the idea that everybody has contextual understanding to a level unattainable before, and then we empowered execution at the lowest levels so that they could decide. And what that did is a couple things. One is made us unbelievably faster because no longer is the chain up to ask permission the limiting factor, which it had been. Also, they have a different level of ownership. And people said, well, you're accepting risk because you're letting people down low or junior people make decisions. Well, one, there's just as smart as I am. The only thing I got is I'm older. And they're closer to the point of action. It was really embodied in this situation where when I first took over, they would wake me up for permission to drop a bomb. There were some targets you couldn't put people on the ground to get, so they needed to drop a bomb on a terrorist leader. They had to get my permission. So they invariably did it about an hour after I went to bed. We worked all night, went to bed right after dawn. So about an hour later, here I am, 50-plus-year-old general, I get a little knock on the door. And they come in and they got a few pieces of paper with a map and an aerial photograph, and they say, "Sir, we have found Abu Bag of Donuts, and we want to drop a bomb on him." And I got a bad sense of humor, so I'd say, "Hey, knock yourself out," and then stop, this is serious. Brief me. And what did I know? I knew what they told me. Really didn't know much more. I've been up all night. I'm not any smarter than anybody else. I'm zero value added to the decision, really. I'm supposed to have this great strategic understanding, but the reality is I didn't know more than they did if we shared information well. So I said, "Why do you do this?" And they said, "Well, we have to because that's our process." I said, "Our process, if I own it, stop it." And they said, "Well, you're responsible." I said, "Well, I'm always responsible, can't give that away. So just stop it." And what happened was, at first people said, "Well, everybody's going to be a lot less responsible. They're going to be a lot quicker, but they're going to be quick on the draw, and they're going to make mistakes, and we're going to have a great cost there." And I thought that was probably true. We got a lot faster, but we actually made fewer mistakes. We started getting better. And we started getting better because they own the decision. And if you think about it, if you go to your boss and your boss doesn't give you the answer but says, "Use your best judgment, let me know what happens," you walk out with a different sense of ownership. You really want to get it right. And that's what happened, and it was very, very effective for us.
So you now see your role as less, do you picture yourself at this point in time as a commander or more as a mentor?
Yeah, it's a great comparison. Much more as a mentor. When we were doing those 18 raids a month, after about 9 months, and I was approving every one still, then we went to 300 raids a month, 10 every night, and I was approving none of them. And so my role shifted dramatically. I shifted from making a lot of decisions to making almost none. And my role became sort of being the ringleader for this conversation across the command that now became lateral as well as vertical. And so my job was to make sure everybody was talking.
And getting people to ask the right questions.
Exactly. Getting people to see, getting people to know, getting people to know each other, crafting the ecosystem, and then letting the ecosystem work.
How much, so you were learning on the fly and getting good feedback, some upside surprises that people were taking responsibility and actually not out there cowboying it, but thinking about it very soberly. What kind of time period did this take place over, and what was your timetable for getting this transformation accomplished?
Yeah. When I took over in October of 2003, it was a 2-year command. So you're going to be in command 24 months. And so I was in a hurry, but we're at war. So it's in peacetime, military is very different. At war, it's like dog years because everything happens really fast. And that war particularly was 24-hour cycles because the enemy changed so quickly. So it was very intense. And of course, the downsides at war. The upside is that you're doing things so fast, you're learning very quickly if you're paying attention. So we were able to change much faster. I would argue we could never have done this change in peacetime because the organization wouldn't have changed just because I said, we're going to need this in war. I had to have the proof that it was working. So I'd say it took about 18 months of combat time. We're deployed the whole time, fighting every single night. Before inside my organization, I thought the change was irreversible, that our culture had changed enough where I didn't have to keep pushing it. And it probably took 18 more months before our partner agencies in the U.S. government, which were partnered with us, really came on board completely as well.
Well, take us from here. As Chris suggested, these military stories are fascinating, but equally fascinating is then how you took these lessons and are teaching transformation inside of organization. From 2005, how much longer were you in the military?
To 2010.
2010.
Yeah.
So you left behind a fundamentally transformed organization.
Inside, That's right. JSOC fundamentally different. It's still that way because the people commanding it today were there when we made the change. So
it's not reverted back to a hierarchical.
No, in fact, I think that's probably never going to go back. We used to make a couple of analogies. The first was JSOC used to be like a bullet. And if the National Command Authority pointed JSOC at the right target and pulled the trigger at the right timing, JSOC's bullet would hit and do well. We had to become the gun. We had to do the aiming. We had to pull it. And so we had to get smart. And so what happened to us is our basic product, which had been raids, had been barrel-chested commandos shooting straight and stalwart personalities, that actually became commoditized. Our real differentiation by 2005 was our network. We connected across 27 countries. We learned very quickly. We informed. And that became our great strength. So they became that, and JSOC, that's their DNA to this day.
Well, that's a real tribute to you that fundamental culture was not just with you, but has sustained. So now it's 2010. You're retiring. What gave you the insight to see, or what allowed you to see the opportunity that there are organizations galore out there, large and small, in the private and nonprofit sector, that could benefit by this kind of transformation?
Yeah, as some of you know, the planning for my retirement happened in a compressed sequence. But I canceled my subscription to Rolling Stone and brought them to their knees. But no, it was actually, in some ways, you go through that kind of testing situation. It tests who you are, and you have to decide who you are at that point. And so I got the opportunity to do that. I was very lucky to find I had a lot of friends. But the other thing we had was this experience. And we had postulated that this experience was not a military unique experience. We had postulated this was not because Al-Qaeda in Iraq was so special. We actually had come to believe that what we'd run into, as I refer to the inflection point, the environment was now changed, really driven by the pace of speed in society, physical and information passage, the increased complexity. And so what we ran into, which was so disorienting, was what other organizations are running into everywhere. Things that worked for our parents and grandparents just don't work anymore, and we're working just as hard. And so...
And the temptation is always to double down, right?
That's what you always do, because nobody ever got fired for doing what worked before. Because you say, hey, look, it always worked, or I followed the checklist. And so we looked at this and we studied it and we started working with companies. And our first client was a company called Scotts Miracle-Gro, and they sell lawn and garden products. And you think, well, that's not a change agent. They can't be smart people, because at the end of the day, they just sell lawn and garden products. Well, I would say they sell dirt and you buy it. So you tell me who's smart. But in fact, it's an organization that had gone through a fundamental change in their environment. The housing crisis had changed people's appetite for that. The outlets through which they sold the products had changed dramatically. So they had to do a fundamental shift. And yet they were this market dominant position. And as we worked with them...
Which ironically is the hardest position to be in to make a fundamental change.
Exactly, because you got a whole constituency that says, for God's sakes, don't screw it up. And there's just not this burning platform. And as we worked with them, we found out the environment was the driver. And as we work with each subsequent partner, we find that that's exactly what happens. Regardless of what field it seems to be in, those who can identify the inflection point and move from this traditional look at how efficient can we be to how adaptable must we be tend to be the most successful.
I've got one or two more questions for him. Then we've left a lot of time to open it up from audience questions. So while I work my way through one or two more, think of questions, just raise your hand. Somebody will get a mic to you. Well, explain the concept of first team and then team of teams.
Sure.
And then we'll open it up.
Sure. If you think about team, I grew up in a world of teams, small teams, sports teams, military teams. And when I think of teams, it's that place where you finish each other's sentences, where you know what each other's thinking. You have this shared sense of trust and common purpose of who you are and what you do. That only scales to a certain level, in my view. If you go to the size of a company in the Roman army, it was a century, it was 100 Legionnaires. You go to a company in the American Army now, and almost every army in the world, it's about 100 people. And the reality is, I've come to believe that 100 people is about the level in which you know everybody. And beyond that, you can call it a team, but it's not as I define it as a team. It's really something else. You start to have subordinate elements. People really identify with something other than the big. They identify with their subpart, their silo or whatever.
By the way, this is proven. The average number of people that will come to your funeral, if you're an average person, is about 100.
There you go.
So.
It'd be about 30 for me. But and so this team thing, and we say we're going to be team this, but you really can't scale that. And then we see startups or small things, they get big, and suddenly because of these silos, they don't communicate. They're not more than the sum of their parts. They're actually less than the sum of their parts, and yet everybody's good people trying to do the right thing. And so the concept of teams is when you scale to get the kind of synergy that you need, you've got to get the connections between the subordinate teams, the various teams, almost like between individuals on a small team. And there are a number of things you do to do that, and information technology can help in a big way with that now. But you've got to create that to be able to scale. And if you can't scale, you can't be adaptable at this point.
Yeah, and everybody who's an investor here is looking for that magical company that can scale. That's what venture capital is all about. Well, let's open it up. Thrust your hand up. A mic will be presented to you. Tim Draper, can you tell us who you are, Tim?
I'm Tim Draper, a venture capitalist. And I also started a school, Draper University. If any of you are 18 to 28, I highly recommend it. So, General, Rich, you didn't ask my question, so I'm going to. But first, will you run for president right now?
Tim, I thought we were friends.
You got to move quickly, I think. Because our country kind of needs this, push the power back down to the individual. But my question is, you talked about how the Army has changed, but that was still land-based. Yeah. We have more threats, I think, through the internet. We have that's where I see most of the long-term threats coming as governments become more virtual, less land-based, less worried about individual bombs going off, more worried about like their entire economy blowing up. How can you get take that same approach and get people, that entire military industrial complex to move toward where we really need it?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that Tim and I talked about briefly before this was the fact that military power is different than it once was. We had several hundred years where military power was really dominated by nation states because you needed a pretty big army, you needed to build weapons, and unless you had a bunch of people, you couldn't do much. And it's really only recently, the last 15 or 20 years, when that power got democratized. And what I mean is, we now have individuals, if they have access to a weapon of mass destruction or even a very crude kind of weapon of mass destruction, to include a keyboard and a computer, that an individual, a very small unit can, or a very small group can do amazing things to big ones. And the problem is there's no way to hold them at risk and therefore deter them in the conventional, traditional sense. You can't say, if you do this, I will bomb your country, because they don't have a country. And finding them is very different. In many cases, if it's a single individual, they don't have the same value system of worrying about that. So now the idea that military power of any kind is going to deter attacks just doesn't hold anymore. And so we've got a whole new problem. Think of what an individual with a hand grenade and a store-bought drone can do to the President of the United States. Those are very difficult to stop, very difficult to shoot down. Suddenly you make the job of protecting key people and key things just really, really problematic. And so you've got this democratization, and so now you can have many more threats. It's like businesses face. It used to be that Coke had to worry about Pepsi and Pepsi had to worry about Coke. Now people have to worry about all of these smaller elements that have very little to lose. They can try something. If it doesn't work, they can do away with it, and they can just try another. Or you have 10,000 monkeys typing on 10,000 typewriters. Somebody's going to get lucky. And so What we need to do, in my view, is our defense needs to be like the human immune system. And the human immune system, I did some study of this with a Yale immunologist, and she really schooled me on it. And really, it's just so extraordinarily brilliant because it's got all the sensors that go out and determine the 10,000 threats the average body gets every day. And it gets these and fends off there and destroys these 10,000 threats without you never knowing it. It just does it automatically as part of this systemic. And it doesn't need the brain to say, hey, go out and do this. It does it organically. And I think we have got to have a defense element, and it's really all elements of national power, that aren't centrally run in the same way that are brought for a big decision. They're going to have to be much more adaptive locally, and they're going to have to be decentralized in execution because they won't be fast enough, and they won't be customized enough to the threat in a certain area, which is sort of counter to the direction that we have been going in national policy because it's tempting to try to centrally manage it.
Next question.
Hi there. I have a question about the VA. I think everyone here would agree that we want to provide health care to the veterans that's at least as good as what the average private citizen can get. Yet, despite the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people working for the VA, you're better off walking into your average local university hospital than a VA hospital. Given that there's so many problems, and given that the private sector does a fine job of providing health care or decent job, why not privatize the VA?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with you. I'm not an expert on the VA. Most of the people who get in the VA system aren't unhappy with the actual health care. They're unhappy with the access, the bureaucracy and things like that, which is, any big government program tends to build up that kind of thing. There's an argument that says that a tremendous percentage of our physicians and medical professionals actually train in VA hospitals, and so it's a significant part of the professionalization of medical care. But I think that's just something that's grown. My personal opinion is I'm not sure that you're not exactly right. I'm not sure that the VA system is the right mechanism to deliver health care. And why make veterans any different than anybody else? Separate but equals, inherently unequal. So as soon as we have people going into separate systems, there's always the danger that one's going to be better or worse than the other. So my tendency is to think you're right.
Chris Hyland talked about, from his perspective, how Citrix worked with you. How did you work with Citrix? What did you see when you came in at their call? And how do you generally go about working your group with companies that bring you in?
Yeah, well, I mean, you had Chris Hyland in there, and he's deranged, so we had to really, No, we come into an organization, and of course, the thing we have found is almost essential is you have to have a leader who understands that they are at a transition point, who perceives we got to do something here. And typically, the entire organization doesn't see that. Some people do, but a good part of the organization doesn't. So the organization, like Citrix, has got to run, got to make money, got to be effective on a daily basis, but also has to do some pretty fundamental changes. And so what we do with someone like Chris is we really enable his team. We don't do any change for an organization. What we do is people who've got busy day jobs and have got to do it, we help them navigate to new processes which shape the culture and make them operate differently. And it takes a good, strong leader at the top.
It takes, I know there are a lot of organizations in this field. Yesterday at our CIO conference, our Forbes CIO conference, Mark Benioff was interviewed on stage, and Mark comes at this from a completely different perspective than you would, with a military background. He actually does a lot of meditation. He works with Tony Robbins. There are different ways that people, I think, are trying to get at this, but I guess my question for you is, how much does this involve sort of deep emotional dives and learning new language and getting people to communicate with each other and value each other in different ways?
Yeah, that's part of it, but what I'd say is we at our heart, we're not just a motivational leadership thing, get people fired up, and because that tends to be a sunburn, tends to wear off. I think it's a part of what you must do. You must inspire people and keep them inspired. But at the end of the day, you have to give people hard, management and leadership techniques, and you have to help them shape processes. Most of us have been off to leadership training. You know, at some point, you go off to a school for a week or two, and you get charged up, and you get a workbook, and you come back to your organization, you take the workbook, and you say, we're going to operate. I went to Peter Senge's course back at MIT years ago, and I come back, and we're going to change. We're going to be a learning organization. And everybody listens to me, and then they go back to work. And then after about a few days, I put the workbook on my shelf, and then after a month, I throw it away because the organization wasn't expecting or ready for me to come back, and I wasn't enough critical mass. So what we do in organizations is help them develop enough critical mass so they change leadership behaviors, but they also change processes, so those things are complementary as they go forward, so the behaviors that they do fit into the process that they want. It's appropriate.
Have you found any generational differences or gender differences? I mean, we're celebrating, going to celebrate tomorrow at the conference the explosion of women entrepreneurs. Beth Comstock, who's the vice chair at GE, is going to be here. And Keith Ferrazzi, immediately after, is going to be talking about motivating millennials. I mean, is it one size fits all? Probably doesn't work, is what I'm saying.
No, it doesn't. What we have found is millennials take to this almost automatically.
They do.
They're used to passing information. They've got a right to know every piece of information in the world anyway. They were born with that right. And so they do this very, very well. We found senior leaders tend to pick it up pretty well, at least philosophically. People in the middle, and we always bash the people in the middle, and they don't deserve it, but people in the middle have more to lose. Because if you're changing the way an organization operates, everybody's looking to see, okay, what's my equity that's going to be lost, my power, you know.
Well, you're almost always going flatter, right?
That's right. In some ways, you're changing certain levers of power they have. What we found is over time, as they got comfortable, they did great. But they are the people who look like or perceive they'll be the bill payers initially.
Well, we've got another question here, and I want to get to one last question, just your thoughts on whether the Middle East will ever, is there any hope? But go ahead.
Thank you. Andrew, big fan of your work. Last year we went through transformation from being a company of 150 employees to more than 300 spread over the globe. So your book came very timely.
Thank you.
And we put a lot of it into action directly and indirectly. So a lot of respect for your work. One question I have that I kind of go looking into the future, your approach focuses a lot on individual and empowering them and kind of providing that shared consciousness. At Google, they approached it a little bit differently, where they pushed the power down, but they pushed it to committees, which to some degree de-risks you a little bit because you get the collective intelligence angle, but at the same time, it removes ownership to the point where, for example, even promotions are done not by direct managers, but the committees of independent people. So what are your thoughts on the sort of empowering individuals and giving them the ownership versus, de-risking most critical decisions? And for Google, I guess they decided that recruiting is the critical decision. So that's committee one. Promotion is critical, and some others.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think an awful lot of things are appropriate for committees when you push down, because you get diversity of thought. You get, busy people, not everybody's got the same amount of time. And so actually in a tremendous number of situations, I think that's exactly the right construct to do. Now the one thing I would say, and I don't know how well, what Google's found out, if you form a committee but you don't have somebody accountable for the output of that committee, how many times have you been on a study group committee, you go to 2 meetings and you realize the committee doesn't have the power to decide anything, and most of the people there don't feel responsible to decide anything, so it grinds and then it just sort of fades away. That's what I would caution against. If you form a committee and you have an expectation for them, somebody's got to be on the bottom line for the output of that committee responsible. Otherwise, I think it becomes almost deceptive. Like this is a committee, but it's really not connected to anything, so it's not going to produce. Does that make sense? Thank you.
We only have about a minute left, so I will just ask you the last question. I know everybody thinks about this at one time or another, but is there any positive outcome to the turmoil in the Middle East that you can see?
Yeah, I'm going to take a second just to say I'd ask everybody to stay and listen to Keith Crotch after that, because he's a good friend of mine and doing some amazing thing at DocuSign. He's going to fix the Mideast. He told me that. No pressure, Keith. No, here's the problem. We look at ISIS, and everybody gets this focus on ISIS, and they just wake up every morning and they say, if only somebody would bomb ISIS or get rid of ISIS, things would be good. I will tell you, if ISIS disappeared tonight, we'd be very disappointed, because ISIS would disappear and we would realize that almost all the problems of that Mideast are right there. And they're going to be there, and they're going to be there the next day, because the problem is ISIS is a symptom of the deterioration of all the structures in the Mideast that have been around about 100 years now. A lot of them bad structures, some good structures, but the bottom line is we've had this amazing number of people who are now refugees who aren't going home, and so they are going to be a factor, a destabilizing factor. Syria's shot to pieces. Iraq is not in much better shape, and you've got different forces, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Turks, all going at different national objectives. And so the real problem in the Mideast is there's no narrative on where the direction of the region's going. You can't get people to say, okay, here's our goal. We're going to try to get a region that looks like this with a balance of power and whatnot. Right now, everybody's got their own version of it, and so they're working to that end. And ISIS got their own version, and they're painting a sort of nihilistic picture of it. Until we can get a narrative crafted, and it really can't come from the West. It's got to be enabled by the West, but it's going to have to come from the region. Then it's going to have a very difficult time going in a coherent direction.
Well, let's all hope for the best there. But let's give let's give General McChrystal a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.